Chapter 1. The ticking fine rain had been falling for days in Dunhaven. A relentless grey curtain that turned the cobblestone streets into rivers and the fields beyond into a sodden wasteland. Theo Grayson hunched over his workbench, the faint glow of a gas lamp casting jagged shadows across the cluttered shop. His fingers, calloused from years of coaxing life into gears and springs, moved with practiced precision as he adjusted the escapement of a pocket watch, its tick a steady heartbeat. In the stillness. At 34, Theo was a man of quiet habits. His life measured in the rhythm of clocks, each repair a small victory against time's inevitable march. The townsfolk called him the Clock Man, a title he wore with a mix of pride and resignation. Though lately, the whispers had turned sharp, edged with suspicion he couldn't quite place. The shop bell jangled, a discordant note that snapped him from his focus. He glanced up, expecting old man Harrow with another broken mantel clock, but the doorway was empty, the rain pounding against the glass like 1,000 impatient fingers. Theo frowned, setting the watch aside, and crossed the room, his boots scuffing the worn floorboards. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly, as if someone had brushed past and left it unlatched. He peered into the gloom beyond, the streetlights flickering through the downpour, but there was no one, just the wind, howling like a thing alive. As he turned back, his foot clutched something solid. It clattered across the floor, a hollow, brittle sound that made his breath catch. He bent down, retrieving it from the shadows near the counter. A clock, or what might have once been a clock, its frame carved from something pale and smooth, its face cracked but intact. The hands, too, of them, long and thin, stood frozen at midnight, or noon. It was hard to tell with the numerals worn to faint scratches. Theo lifted it, his fingers tracing the carving spirals and jagged lines that felt too deliberate to be mere decoration. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been, and cold, as if it had been dredged from the bottom of the sea. He set it on the counter, the gas lamp's light catching the surface. Bone. The realization hit him like a punch. It wasn't wood or ivory, but bone, polished to a sickly sheen, the kind of material no sane craftsman would use. A chill crept up his spine, but curiosity, that old companion, held him fast. He tapped the glass face with a screwdriver, expecting silence, but a faint tick answered, slow and uneven, like a pulse struggling to find its rhythm. The hands twitched, jerking forward a fraction, then stilled. Theo's heart thudded in his chest, louder than the rain outside. He hadn't wounded it, hadn't touched its mechanism, yet it moved. He reached for his tools, intent on prying it open, when the shop bell rang again. This time, it was Harrow, his coat dripping, his face creased with the weight of years. "Evening, Theo," Harrow rasped, eyeing the bone clock with a flicker of unease. "What's that you've got there?" "Found it," Theo said, keeping his tone light, though his hands tightened around the screwdriver. "Washed up in the rain, maybe. You ever seen anything like it?" Harrow squinted, leaning closer, then stepped back as if stuck. "No, and I'd rather not. Looks like something the sea spat out to curse us. You'd do well to toss it back where it came from." Theo forced a laugh, but it died in his throat as Harry shuffled to the counter with his usual broken clock, muttering about the weather and the fishing boats that hadn't returned. The old man paid his coin and left, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Theo alone with the bone clock. Its tick had steadied now, a relentless beat that seemed to mark the silence. He should have listened to Harrow, should have thrown it into the swollen river beyond the town's edge, but the craftsman in him wouldn't let go. He needed to know how it worked, why it worked. Night. Theo carried the bone clock to his upstairs apartment, a cramped space above the shop filled with half-finished projects and the faint smell of oil and dust. He set it on the table, its pale frame stark against the dark wood, and lit a candle, the flame trembling as if nervous in its presence. He pried off the back with a chisel, revealing a tangle of gear, some brass, some bone, all impossibly intricate, moving without a spring or weight he could see. The mechanism pulsed, a faint vibration he felt more than heard, and as he stared into it, the room seemed to tilt. A vision came, sharp and unbidden. Harrow, standing on the docks, his coat flapping in a storm that wasn't the one outside. The old man's face twisted in terror as the sea rose, black and churning, swallowing the pier in a single gulp. Theo saw the water close over Harrow's head, his hands clawing at nothing, his scream lost in the roar, then darkness. He jolted back, the candle flame snapping upright, the bone clock ticking calmly as if nothing had happened. His breath came in ragged gasps, his shirt clinging to his sweat-soaked skin. It was a dream, he told himself, a trick of exhaustion and the late hour. But the image lingered, vivid and real, the salt tang of the sea still sharp in his nose. The next morning, the news came with the milk delivery. Harrow was dead swept off the docks in the night, his body found tangled in the nets at dawn. The town burst with it, voices low and fearful, blaming the storm, the sea, the foolishness of an old man who should have known better. Theo stood, frozen in his shop, the bone clock's tick echoing in his ears, steady and slow, a metronome to his growing dread. He hadn't seen a dream. He'd seen the truth. He locked the shop early, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by, and carried the clock back upstairs. His hands shook as he stared at it, the hands now pointing to 3 o'clock, or was it 9? The numerals were too faded to tell, but they'd moved. He was sure of it. He didn't dare touch the gears again, didn't dare look too long, but the question gnawed at him. If it had shown Harrow's death, what else could it show? Chapter 3. The widow's plebeian noon. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and Dunhaven stirred with its usual rhythm, fishers hauling their meagre catches, shopkeepers sweeping water from their stoops. Theo sat at his workbench, the boat clock hidden under a cloth, its tick muffled but persistent, when the bell rang again. This time it was Maria Finch, a widow whose husband had drowned 2 winters past, her face pale and sharp, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "Theo," she said, her voice trembling, "I need your help." He nodded, gesturing to the stall across the counter, though his gut twisted at the sight of her. Maria was a regular, bringing him clocks her husband had collected, each one a silent plea for something he couldn't give comfort, answers, a way to fill the void. Today, though, she carried nothing but a folded letter, its edges worn as if she'd clutched it too long. "It's about Sam," she said, unfolding the paper. "I found this in his old trunk last night. It's not his writing, but it's his name." Theo took the letter, his fingers brushing hers, cold as the bone clock's frame. The script was jagged, uneven. "Sam Finch will drown again, and the clock will turn." Below it, a crude sketch of a clock, its hands at 6, carved from something that looked too much like bone. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, the tick in his ears growing louder. "I don't know," Maria whispered. "It was just there, like it appeared." "Theo, I've been hearing things, ticks, whispers, like he's trying to tell me something. You're the clock man. You fix things. Can you fix this?" He wanted to say no, to send her away, but the desperation in her eyes pinned him in place. "I'll look into it," he lied, folding the letter and handing it back. "But it's probably nothing, just the storm playing tricks." She nodded, unconvinced, and left, her footsteps fading into the rain. Theo pulled the cloth from the bone clock, its hands now at 6, or had they always been there? He couldn't tell anymore, couldn't trust his own eyes. That night, he dreamed of Sam Finch, a man he'd barely known, standing on a sinking boat, his mouth open in a silent scream, as the sea claimed him again. When he woke, the clock's hands had moved back to 5. Chapter 4. The second Theo didn't sleep after Maria left. He sat at the table, the bone clock glaring back at him, its tick a steady accusation. The vision of Sam Finch clung to him, the man's face bloated and blue, his eyes wide with a terror that wasn't just death, but something worse, something endless. Theo's hands hovered over the clock, itching to smash it, to silence it, but fear held him back. What if it wasn't just a vision? What if it was a command? He poured a glass of whiskey, the burn steadying his nerves, and flipped through his ledger, a record of every clock he'd repaired. Harrow's name stared back at him, dated 3 days ago, a simple fix for a mantel clock that wouldn't chime. Now the old man was dead, and the bone clock had shown him. He slammed the ledger shut, the sound swallowed by the tick, tick, tick. The shop bell rang again, startling him so badly the glass slipped, shattering on the floor. He cursed, grabbing a rag, and descended the stairs, expecting a distraught customer. It was Jonas, the fishmonger, his broad frame filling the doorway, his apron stained with blood and brine. "Clockman," Jonas said, his voice gruff. "You hear about Harrow?" Theo nodded, wiping his hands on the rag. "Yeah, terrible thing. More than terrible," Jonas muttered, stepping inside, dripping rain onto the floor. "Folks are saying the sea's angry, taking what's hers. My nets came up empty today, nothing but bones, fish bones, picked clean like something chewed him dry." Theo's stomach twisted. the word bones echoing too close to the clock upstairs. Storms probably stirred things up, he said, forcing calm. It'll pass. Jonas eyed him, suspicion flickering in his weathered face. Maybe, but you've been odd lately, Theo. Locked up early yesterday, pale as a ghost today. You know something, don't you? Don't be daft, Theo snapped, sharper than he meant. I fix clocks, not storms. Jonas grunted, unconvinced, and left, the door banging shut. Theo locked it behind him, his hands trembling as he climbed back upstairs. The bone clock's hands had moved again to 4. He stared, bar rising in his throat. 4 o'clock, or 4 deaths. He didn't know. Didn't want to know. But the visions came anyway. This time, it was Jonas. The fishmonger stood in his shed, gutting a catch, when the knife slipped or was pulled sinking into his chest. Blood sprayed bright and red, and his scream gurgled into silence as he fell, the shed's walls closing in like a coffin. Theo stumbled back, knocking over the candle, wax falling on the table as the vision faded. The clock ticked on, indifferent. Chapter 5. The weight of knowing morning brought confirmation. Jonas was dead, found in his shed, the knife buried to the hilt, his face frozen in shock. The town mourned, but the whispers grew louder, curses, bad omens, and Theo's name tangled in the mix. He didn't leave the shop, didn't dare face the eyes that followed him now, accusing, fearful. The bone clock sat uncovered, its hands at 3, its tick a relentless trumpet. He tried to work, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of gears, but his hands shook too much, dropping screws, fumbling springs. The clock's presence was a weight, a shadow that stretched across the room, and when he closed his eyes, he saw them harrow, Jonas, some Finch staring back, their mouths moving, in silent pleas. A knock at the door jolted him. It was Mara again, her coat soaked, her face gaunt. Theo, she said, stepping inside without waiting. It's happening again. I heard him Sam last night, whispering my name. And the ticking, it's everywhere. He swallowed, glancing at the stairs. Mara, you need to rest. It's the grief, don't lie to me. She snapped, her voice cracking. You know something. That letter, it's tied to you, to this place. What did you find? He hesitated, then led her upstairs, pulling the cloth from the bone clock. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's it, she whispered. The sketch, it's the same. I don't know what it is, Theo said, his voice raw. But it shows things. Deaths. Harrow, Jonas, Sam. She finished, her eyes wide. You saw him too. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. It moves backward, Mara. Every time someone dies, the hands. She grabbed his arm, her grip bruising. Then stop it. Break it. Burn it, do something. I tried, he admitted, pulling free. It won't break. It just comes back. She stared at the clock, tears streaking her face, then lunged for it, snatching a hammer from his workbench. Before he could stop her, she swung, the head cracking against the bone frame. The sound was deafening, a scream, not of metal or wood, but something alive, reverberating through the room. The clock fell, splintered, gears spilling across the floor, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then the pieces twitched, gears rolled back, bone fused, and the clock reformed, whole and ticking, its hands still at 3. Mara dropped the hammer, sobbing, and Theo sank to his knees, the weight of it all crushing him. The keeper's game had only begun. Chapter 6. The third deathly silence after Mara's failed attempt lasted only a heartbeat. The tick returned, steady and relentless, as if mocking their desperation. Theo stared at the reformed clock, its pale frame gleaming under the candlelight, the hands still pointing to 3, or what he assumed was 3, the faded numerals blurring into meaningless scratches. Mara slumped against the table, her sobs quieting into a trembling hush, her eyes fixed on the floor where the hammer lay useless. We can't stop it, she whispered, her voice hollow. It's alive, Theo. It's playing with us. He didn't answer, couldn't find words to counter the truth sinking into his bones. The clock wasn't just a thing, it was a presence, a will, and it had marked them both. He stood, his legs unsteady, and pulled the cloth back over it, though. The tick pierced through, undeterred. Go home, Mara, he said finally, his throat dry. Rest. I'll figure this out. She shook her head, but exhaustion won, and she shuffled downstairs, leaving him alone with the ticking nightmare. Theo locked the door behind her, the bolt sliding home with a clang that echoed too loud in the empty shop. He didn't sleep that night, didn't dare close his eyes. Instead, he sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, the bone clock's rhythm syncing with the pulse in his temples. Morning brought no relief. The drizzle persisted, a grey shroud over Dunhaven. And with it came the news, delivered by the milk boy's shout down the street. Mary Tanner's gone. Burned up in her oven. Theo's gut clenched, the name striking like a bell. Mary, the baker, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and a laugh that filled her shop. He'd seen her just days ago, fixing her wall clock, joking about the damp, ruining her dough. He stumbled downstairs, the bone clock's tick following him, and yanked the cloth away. The hands had moved to 2. His breath hitched, the memory of the vision crashing back. Mary, her apron catching fire, the flames licking up her arms as she screamed, the oven door slamming shut behind her, trapping her in a coffin of heat and iron. He'd seen it, hours before it happened, and done nothing. The shop bell jangled, and Theo spun, the cloth slipping from his fingers. It was Eliza, Mary's daughter, her face streaked with tears, her apron still dusted with flour, from a shift she'd never finish. "Theo," she choked out, "you were there yesterday. Did she say anything? Did she know?" He froze, the weight of her gaze pinning him. "No," he lied, his voice cracking. "She was fine. It's a terrible thing, Eliza. I'm sorry." She nodded, dazed, and left, her sobs fading into the rain. Theo sank onto the stool, his hands trembling as he stared at the clock. Two more, it seemed to say, and he couldn't shake the certainty that he was next, or worse, that he was the cause. The visions weren't warnings, they were promises. Chapter 7. The town's Eisby noon. Dunhaven was a hive of murmurs. Theo ventured out, needing air, needing to escape the clock's relentless gaze. But the streets offered no respite. Faces turned as he passed fishers pausing mid-hall, shopkeepers peering from doorways, their eyes sharp with something he hadn't seen before. Fear, yes, but also accusation. He heard the whispers, carried on the damp wind. Clockman's cursed, Harrow, Jonas, now Mary always near him. Something's wrong with that shop. He ducked into the tavern, the Bell and Anchor, hoping for a moment's peace, but even there, the air was thick with suspicion. The barkeep, Tom Carver, slid him a pint without a word, his jaw tight. Theo sipped, the ale bitter on his tongue, and listened as the room buzzed around him. 3 dead in a week, a fisher named Pete muttered, his voice low but carrying. Storm's bad, sure, but this ain't natural. Harrow swept away. Jonas stabbed by his own blade. Mary cooked in her oven. Clockman was at Mary's yesterday. Another voice cut in, sharp and female. Lydia, the seamstress, fixed her clock, left, and now she's gone. I saw him skulking around Jonas's shed too. Day before. Theo's grip tightened on the mug, his knuckles whitening. He wanted to shout, to tell them it wasn't him, that the bone clock was the curse, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That he saw their deaths before they happened, that a thing of bone and gears whispered to him in the night. They'd call him mad, or worse, guilty. He slipped out, the rain cold against his face, and hurried back to the shop. The bone clock waited, its hands still at 2, its tick a steady taunt. He grabbed a hammer, not Marat's, but his own, heavier, forged for breaking, and swung, aiming for the face. The glass shattered, shards flying, but the bone held, the gears grinding on, unbroken. He swung again, and again, until the hammer slipped, clattering to the floor, and the clock set whole, mocking him with its silence. Then the tick resumed, louder, insistent. A vision hit him, unbidden. Lydia, the seamstress, her needle slipping as she worked, piercing her throat, blood soaking the fabric as she gasped, her hands clawing at the wound. Theo staggered back, the room spinning, the tick filling his skull. He ran downstairs, locking the shop, and barricaded himself in, the hammer still in hand, useless against the inevitable. Chapter 8. The 4th Mark Lydia died that afternoon. The news came with a scream from her shop, carried down the street by a neighbor's wail. Theo heard it through the boarded windows, his hands pressed to his ears, but the bone clock's tick drowned it out, a rhythm he couldn't escape. When he dared look, the clock's hands pointed to 1. He didn't leave the shop for 2 days, didn't eat, barely drank, his world shrinking to the clock and its whispers. The town's anger grew, a storm brewing beyond his walls. He heard them shouts, footsteps, the clatter of stones against the shutters. Clockman's a murderer, someone yelled, and a brick crashed through the glass, landing at his feet, dust swirling in the dim light. Marat came on the 3rd day, pounding on the door until he let her in. She looked worse than he felt, her hair wild, her eyes sunken, a feverish glint in them. "They're coming for you," she said, breathless. "They think you're killing them." "Theo, what's happening?" "It's the clock," he rasped, leading her upstairs. "It shows me every time someone dies. It moves back." "Harrow, Jonas, Mary, Lydia, and Sam," she said, her voice breaking. "You saw him too." He nodded, the guilt choking him. "I don't know how to stop it. I break it, it comes back. I see them die, and then they do." She stared at the clock, its hands at one, and grabbed his arm. "Then we burn it. Fire's different, fire cleanses. My husband used to say that." Theo hesitated, the memory of the hammer's failure sharp, but Marat's desperation spurred him. They dragged the clock to the fireplace, the wood already stacked from a winter that never came. He struck a match, the flame trembling as he tossed it in, and Marat added kindling, the fire roaring to life. They pushed the clock into the blaze, the bone crackling, the gears hissing as they melted or seemed to. The flames died too fast, unnaturally fast, and from the ashes, the bone clock emerged whole, untouched, its tick louder than ever. Marat screamed, backing away, and Theo fell to his knees, the heat still stinging his face. The hands hadn't moved, they stayed at one, but the tick was a voice now, low and rasping, threading through the air. "One more, Theo. One more, and you'll see." Chapter 9. The keeper's whispery voice changed everything. It wasn't just a sound, it was alive, a presence that filled the room, cold and heavy, pressing against his skull. "Who are you?" Theo whispered, his voice trembling, the clock's tick syncing with his heartbeat. "The keeper," it answered, the word a hiss that coiled around him. "I count what's owed." "Feed me and live forever." "Feed you?" he echoed, dread pouring in his gut. "You mean the death's Harrow, Jonas, they were mine," the keeper said, its voice a chorus now, overlapping, grating. "Give me more, and time bends for you." "Refuse, and you're next." Theo's mind reeled, the offer sinking in eternal. Life for a price he couldn't pay, wouldn't pay. But the clock didn't wait for his answer. A vision came, sharper than before. Marat, standing in her kitchen, a knife in her hand, not cutting bread but her own wrist, blood pooling on the floor as she stared at nothing, her lips moving in a silent plea. The tick surged, triumphant, and Theo lunged for her, pulling her from the room. "No," he shouted, dragging her downstairs. "You are not dying, not for this thing." She fought him, wild-eyed, her nails raking his arm. "Let me go. If it's me, it stops Sam comes back, it's lying." He roared, pinning her against the wall. "It's not Sam, it's using you." The door rattled, voices outside growing, louder, angry, frantic. The town had come. Their patience snapped, and Theo knew they'd break in soon. He released Marat, her sobs echoing as she sank to the floor, and turned to the clock, its hands still at one, its voice whispering promises he couldn't unhear. Chapter 10. The mob's furious door gave way with a splintering crash, and the townsfolk poured in. Pete the fisher, Tom Carver from the tavern, Eliza Tanner with her tear-streaked face, and a dozen others, their eyes burning with rage and fear. Theo stumbled back, Marat scrambling behind him as they advanced, makeshift weapons in hand, fishhooks, hammers, a length of chain. "You killed them," Eliza screamed, her voice raw. "My mother, Jonas, Lydia, it's not me." Theo shouted, his hands raised, the bone clocks tick a deafening roar in his ears. "It's that thing upstairs, it's doing this." Pete spat, his hook gleaming in the dim light. "Lies. You've been skulking around, bringing death wherever you go. We've had enough, clockman." Theo grabbed Marat, pulling her toward the back door, but Tom blocked it, his bulk unyielding. "No running," he growled, raising the hammer. "You end this here." A vision hit Theo mid-step. Tom, swinging the hammer, not at him but at Pete, the fish's skull cracking open, blood spraying across the shop. The tick surged, and Theo acted without thinking, shoving Tom aside, the hammer clattering to the floor. Pete lunged, his hook slashing Theo's arm, a hot line of pain that made him stagger. "Stop," Marat cried, throwing herself between them, her voice shrill. "He's trying to save you." The room froze, her words hanging in the air, but the tick didn't stop. The vision shifted Pete again, this time falling through the floor, the boards giving way, his scream cut short as he hit the stone below. Theo spun, too late, as the floor creaked and snapped, Pete vanishing into the dark, a sickening thud echoing up. Silence fell, broken only by the tick, the clock's hands moving back to 2. The mob stared, horror replacing rage, and Theo seized the moment, dragging Mara out the back, the rain swallowing their footsteps as they fled into the night. Chapter 11. The hunted Theo ran through the alleys, the town's shouts fading behind them, the bone clock's weight dragging at Theo's pocket. He hadn't meant to take it, hadn't even grabbed it, but there it was, cold and heavy, its tick a constant companion. Mara clung to him, her breath ragged, her wrist trembling where she'd nearly cut it. "Where do we go?" she gasped, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "The church," Theo said, his voice hoarse. "Father Declan, he'll know something." Anything. The streets were a maze, the rain blurring the world into a grey haze. But Theo knew Dunhaven's bones better than most. They dodged past the tavern, the docks, the seamstress's shuttered shop, each corner a memory of Death Harrow. Jonas, Mary, Lydia, Pete. The clock's tick grew louder, a pulse that matched his racing heart, and he couldn't shake the keeper's voice. "Feed me." They reached the church as the mob shouts grew distant, the steeple looming like a sentinel. Theo pounded on the door, his fists bruising against the wood, until it creaked open, revealing Father Declan, his cassock damp, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp with alarm. "What in God's name?" Declan began, then saw the blood on Theo's arm, Mara's pale face. Inside now, they stumbled in, the sanctuary's dim light flickering from candles, and Theo pulled the bone clock from his pocket, slamming it onto the altar. "This," he said, breathless, "is killing them. It's a 2 again. Pete's dead, and they think it's me." Declan crossed himself, his gaze locked on the clock. "The devil's work," he muttered, then met Theo's eyes. "Tell me everything." Chapter 12. The keepers offer Theo spilled it all: the clock's arrival, the visions, the deaths, the voice, his words tumbling over each other as Mara nodded, her hands clasped tight. Declan listened, his face darkening with each detail, the candlelight casting shadows that twisted like spectres. When Theo finished, the priest rose, retrieving a leather-bound book from the vestry, its pages brittle and stained. "This is old," Declan said, opening it to a marked page. 1673 Elias Crow, clockmaker. Lost his family to plague, carved a clock from their bones, made a pact with something dark to cheat death. Burned for it, but the clock vanished. "That's it," Theo said, staring at the sketch in the book. Spirals, jagged lines, bone. "But why me? Why now?" "The storm," Declan replied, his voice low. "It brings things back, things that should stay buried. This keeper, it feeds on souls, Theo. You're its tool now, then stop it." Mara snapped, her voice trembling. "Exorcise it, do something." Declan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try, but it's strong, older than my faith. Maybe." The bone clock's tick surged, and the keeper's voice rasped through the church. "Feed me, Theo. One more, and you're free." The candles flickered, bending to the sound, and a vision hit Declan, his crucifix snapping, his throat torn open by unseen hands, blood pooling on the altar. Theo grabbed the priest, pulling him back, but the tick only laughed, low and guttural. "It's choosing," Theo whispered, dread choking him. "It wants you next." Chapter 13. The priest's church door creaked shut behind them, muffling the distant shouts of Dunhaven's mob, but the bone clock's tick cut through the silence, sharp and relentless. Theo set it on the altar, its pale frame glinting in the candlelight, and slumped into a pew, his arm throbbing where Pete's hook had slashed it. Mara sat beside him, her coat dripping, her eyes darting to the clock as if it might leap at her. Father Declan stood over it, his face a mask of grim resolve, the leather-bound book clutched in his hands. "You've brought a plague into this town," Declan said, his voice low but steady. "This keeper, it's no mere spirit. It's something ancient, something that feeds on more than fear." "Then tell me how to kill it." Theo rasped, his throat raw from shouting, running, pleading. "It's a two more deaths, and it's done with me or her, or you." Declan opened the book, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced the faded script. "Elias Crow didn't just make a clock," he said. "He made a pact, offered his family's bones to something beyond death, something that promised eternity. The church burned him, but the clock, it's a vessel, Theo. It's alive because it's bound to that pact." Mara's breath hitched, her hands clenching into fists. "Then unbind it. You're a priest, do your job." Declan's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap back. "I'll need time, prayers, holy water, maybe the old cross in the crypt." But it's fighting back already, those visions. The bone clock's tick surged, and the keeper's voice rasped through the sanctuary, cold and mocking. "Feed me, Theo. To more, and time bends for you." The candles flickered, their flames bending as if in submission, and Theo's head throbbed, Another vision clawing at his mind, Eliza Tanner. Her hands wrapped around a rope, tightening it around her own neck, her eyes bulging as she choked. The tavern's rafters creaking above her. "No," Theo shouted, slamming his fists against the pew. The vision fading, but leaving its mark sweat on his brow, bile in his throat. "It's choosing again, Eliza, she's next." Declan grabbed a vial of holy water from the altar, splashing it over the clock. The liquid hissed, steaming on the bone, but the tech didn't falter. "It's laughing at us," he muttered, his faith wavering in his voice. "We need more than this." Chapter 14. The archives of Dusticlan led them to the vestry, a cramped room smelling of mildew and wax, where he pulled more books from a sagging shelf, parish records, journals, scraps of lore from Dunhaven's shadowed past. Theo paced, the bone clock's tick following him like a shadow, while Mara sat, her gaze distant, her lips moving silently as if whispering to someone unseen. "Here," Declan said, slamming a journal shut, dust billowing into the air. "A fisherman's log. 1721 found a bone clock washed ashore after a storm. Said it whispered names." He threw it back, but his crew died anyway, one by one. "It's been here before." Theo comes and goes, feeding as it pleases. "Then why me?" Theo demanded, his voice cracking. "I didn't ask for this. I'm no Elias crew." "The storm brought it," Declan said, his eyes hard. "You're just the one who picked it up. It doesn't care who, it needs a hand to turn its gears. Endure it." Mara stood suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I heard him again through the ticking. He's in there, trapped. It's lying." Theo snapped, grabbing her shoulders. "It's not Sam, it's the keeper, twisting you." She shook him off, her eyes wild. "You don't know that. You see deaths, I hear him. Maybe it's both, maybe it can give him back." Declan stepped between them, his voice firm. "Enough. It's playing you both divide and conquer. We need to focus, find a way to break the pact." The bone clock's voice cut through, sharper now. "Feed me, Theo." Eliza's waiting. The vision returned, vivid and cruel Eliza, the rope snapping tight, her feet kicking the air, her face turning purple. Theo staggered, clutching the wall, and Declan splashed more holy water, chanting a prayer in Latin. But the tick only grew louder, triumphant. Chapter 15. The keeper's command Eliza died that night. The news came with a scream from the tavern, carried on the wind as Theo, Mara, and Declan fuddled in the church. The bone clock's hands moved back to one, and the keeper's voice purred. "Good, Theo." "One more, and you are free." Theo's hand shook. The vision of Eliza's death burned into his mind, her body swinging, the mob's shouts turning to wails. "I didn't do it," he whispered. But the guilt gnawed at him, a worm in his gut. He'd seen it, hadn't stopped it. Could he have? Declan's prayers faltered, his voice hoarse. "It's too strong. I need the crypt cross. It's blessed. Older than this church." "Stay here." He vanished into the shadows, leaving Theo and Mara alone with the clock. She stared at it, her breathing shallow, and Theo saw the knife in her hand, small, sharp, snatched from the vestry table. "Mara, no." He started, but she moved fast, slashing at her wrist, blood welling dark and fast. "It's me," she said, her voice flat. "Sam said if I go, he comes back." Theo lunged, knocking the knife away, pinning her arms as she thrashed. "It's lying," he roared, his voice echoing of the stone. "You are not dying for this." She went limp, sobbing, and he dragged her to a pew, binding her wrist with his shirt, the blood soaking through. The bone clock's tick surged, the hands hitting zero, and the keeper's voice laughed, deep and guttural. "You defied me, Theo. Now you serve." The church darkened, candles snuffing out, and Theo felt it a pull, cold and insistent, sinking into his bones, his mind. He dropped the clock, but it didn't matter. The command was inside him, whispering, guiding. His feet moved, not his own, toward the door, the rain lashing his face as he stepped into the night. Chapter 16. The unseen Hanthy town was a blur. The bone clocks tick a drumbeat in his skull, the keeper's voice a leash he couldn't break. "Feed me," it whispered, and Theo's hands obeyed, though his mind screamed against it. He found himself at the docks, Pete's lantern still burning where he'd fallen, the mob's shouts distant now. Tom Carver stood there, repairing a net, his back to Theo. "No," Theo muttered, his voice a plea, but his hands closed around a rope, heavy with a fisherman's knot. He swung, the rope catching Tom's neck, pulling tight, the barkeep's gasp cut short as he collapsed, the sea swallowing his body with a muted splash. The bone clock's hands moved back to one, Theo stumbled back, while rising, his hands trembling with Tom's blood, imagined or real. He couldn't tell. The keeper's voice purred. "Good, Theo. You're learning." He ran, the rain washing the guilt from his skin but not his soul, back to the church, where Moreau lay unconscious, Declan emerging from the crypt with a rusted cross in hand. "What did you do?" Declan demanded, seeing the blood on Theo's hands, the wildness in his eyes. "It made me," Theo rasped, collapsing against the altar. "Tom's dead, I couldn't stop it." Declan's face hardened, the cross trembling in his grip. "It's in you now," the pact shifting. "We're running out of time." Chapter 17. The exorcisms. Declan prepared the exorcism, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. He placed the crypt cross over the bone clock, splashing it with holy water, chanting in Latin as the candles flared back to life. Theo held Moreau, her pulse weak but there, her wrist bandaged, her face pale as death. The bone clock's tick fought back, a grating screech that shook the walls, the keeper's voice roaring, "You can't take me." The air thickened, shadows twisting into shapes Harrow, Jonas, Mary, Lydia, Pete, Tom, their faces hollow, their mouths moving in silent screams. Declan's chant grew louder, the cross glowing faintly, and the bone clock shuddered, its gears grinding to a halt. For a moment, Theo dared to hope until the cross snapped, splintering in Declan's hands, and the keeper's laugh filled the church, deep and victorious. "You are mine," it said, and the shadows lunged, not at Declan but at Theo, their hands cold and real, dragging him toward the clock. He fought, clawing at the air, but the keeper's pull was stronger, sinking into his marrow, rewriting him. Moreau stirred, screaming his name, and Declan swung the broken cross, striking the clock, a burst of light blinding them all. When it faded, the clock sat still, its hands at one, the shadows gone. But Theo felt it, the keeper's whisper, now a part of him, a hunger he couldn't shake. "It's not over," he whispered, dread choking him. "It's just begun." Chapter 18. The betrayal seat. The church was a tomb, its silence broken only by the bone clock's tick, steady and smug, its hands frozen at one. Theo sat against the altar, his hands stained with Tom's imagined blood, the keeper's whisper, a constant hum in his skull. "Feed me, Theo, feed me." Moreau lay on the pew, her wrist bandaged, her breathing shallow but alive, while Father Declan clutched the broken crypt cross, his face a mask of defeat. The shadows of the dead lingered in the corners, faint but watching Harrow, Jonas, Mary, Lydia, Pete, Tom, their eyes hollow, their presence a weight on Theo's soul. "We can't fight it," Declan said, his voice a rasp, the Latin prayers abandoned. "It's too deep, too old." "The cross was our last hope, then what?" Theo snapped, his voice raw. "It's in me. I killed Tom, felt it pull me. It'll take her next, or you." Moreau stirred, her eyes fluttering open, glassy with fever or something worse. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's closer. Now, I heard him through the ticking." He said I can bring him back." Theo lunged to her side, grabbing her shoulders. "No, Moreau, it's the keeper, not Sam. It's lying to you." She shoved him off, her strength unnatural, her eyes wild with a fire he hadn't seen before. "You don't know that. You see deaths, I hear him. Maybe it's both, maybe it needs one more, and he's free." Declan stepped forward, his broken cross raised. "She's lost. Theo, it's got her mind. We need to bind her, keep her from." Moreau moved faster, snatching a candlestick from the altar, her movements jerky, puppet-like. "No," she screamed, swinging it at Declan, the metal cracking against his skull. He crumpled, blood pooling beneath him, and Theo lunged, tackling her to the floor, the candlestick clattering away. "What are you doing?" he roared, pinning her arms, her thrashing wild and desperate. "It's you," she spat, her voice a snarl. "It told me your blood, your life, it'll trade you for Sam." "I'm sorry, Theo, I have to." She clawed at his face, nails raking his cheek, and he shoved her back, scrambling to his feet. The bone clock's tick surged, the keeper's voice laughing. "Yes, Moreau, feed me." And Theo felt it, the pull again, stronger, tagging at his hands, his will. He stumbled toward the altar, the clock blowing faintly, its hands trembling at 1. Chapter 19. The exorcisms. For Declan groaned, blood trickling from his temple, and dragged himself up, the broken cross still in hand. "Theo," he rasped, "hold her, I'll finish it." Theo grabbed Moreau, pinning her against the pew, her screams echoing through the church, half hers, half something else. A chorus of whispers that weren't Sam's. Declan staggered to the altar, splashing the last of the holy water, his voice rising in a desperate chant. Exorciser T. Omnis Spiritus Iman. The bone clock shuddered, its gears grinding, and the keeper's voice roared, "You can't take me." The shadows surged Harrow, Jonas, Mary, Lydia, Pete, Tom solid now, their hands clawing at Declan, tearing at his cassock, his flesh. He swung the cross, striking the clock, a burst of light flaring. But it snapped again, the pieces flying, and the shadows closed in. Theo watched, helpless as Declan screamed, his throat torn open by unseen hands, blood spraying across the altar, the floor, the clock. The light faded, the shadows retreated, and Declan fell, his eyes wide and empty, his last breath a gurgle. The bone clock's hands spun wildly, then settled back to 2. Mara went limp, sobbing, and Theo released her, his hands trembling with rage, guilt, fear. "You killed him," he whispered, his voice breaking. "For nothing, for a lie." "It's not a lie," she said, her voice small, broken. "Sam's still there, I feel him." The keeper's voice purred. "She's right, Theo." "Feed me again." And see, a vision hit Theo himself, standing on the cliffs, the clock in his hands, the sea rising to swallow him, the town burning behind. He shook it off, the tick a hammer in his skull, and grabbed the clock, its bone frame cold and alive under his touch. "No more," he said, his voice a growl. "You're done." Chapter 20. The cliffs of Dunhaven. Theo ran, the bone clock clutched to his chest. Its tick a siren call he couldn't silence. The church door banged shut behind him, Mara's cries fading, the rain lashing his face as he stumbled through the streets. The mob was close, he heard their shouts, saw their lanterns flickering in the distance. A hunt for the clockman who'd cursed them all. He didn't care, couldn't care. The keeper's whisper drove him, a leash he couldn't break, but he'd end it, one way or another. The cliffs loomed ahead, Dunhaven's edge, where the land dropped into the churning sea, black and endless. He climbed, the mud slick under his boots, the bone clock's weight dragging at him, its voice relentless. "Feed me, Theo. You can't escape." The mob's shouts grew louder, their lights bobbing closer. But he reached the top, the wind howling, the sea roaring below. He held the clock over the edge, its hands at 2, the keeper's laugh echoing in his ears. "You're mine," it said, and the vision returned him falling, the clock sinking, the town consumed. His hands shook, the tick sinking with his pulse, and he saw them harrow. Jonas, Mary, Lydia, Pete, Tom, Declan standing behind him, their faces hollow, their hands reaching. "No," he roared, and smashed the clock against the rock, the bone splintering, the gears flying, the glass shattering into the wind. The tick stopped, the silence deafening, and for a moment he thought he'd won until the pieces twitched, rolling back, reforming, the bone fusing into a whole, its hands spinning to 0. The keeper's voice laughed, deep and final. "You can't destroy me, Theo. You are me." Chapter 21. Chilling resolution. The keeper's facethe world tilted, the cliffs blurring as the bone clock glowed, its light searing into Theo's eyes. He stumbled back, the mob shouts fading, the sea's roar a distant hum, and saw his reflection in the cracked glass, not his face, but the keeper's, a shadow with too many hands, too many eyes, a grin that stretched beyond flesh. "You've been mine since the start," it said, its voice his own now, echoing from within. He clawed at his chest, his face, but the truth sank in cold, sharp, undeniable. He'd died that first night, when the clock ticked awake, his soul, claimed in the vision of Harrow's death. The town, the deaths, the chase, all a play, a cycle to trap him, to make him the new vessel. The keeper wasn't Elias Crow anymore, it was Theo Grayson, the clock man, reborn in bone and blood. The mob reached him, their faces twisted with rage. Pete's brother, Eliza's kin, Tom's wife, but they froze, their eyes widening as the bone clock pulsed, its light swallowing the cliffs, the sea, the sky. Theo's body softened, his bones cracking, reshaping, the clock sinking into his flesh, fusing with his ribs, his hands, his skull. He screamed, but the sound was the tick, loud and eternal, and the mob fell back, their shouts turning to wails as he rose, not Theo, but the keeper, his former nightmare of bone and shadow, his grin wide and wet. "Feed me," he said, his voice a chorus of the dead, and the town burned, the flames rising as the cycle began anew. He turned, the cliffs empty now, the mob gone, and walked into the rain, The bone clocks tick his heartbeat, his purpose, his curse. Chapter 22. The cycle continued days later. Mara sat in her kitchen, the rain a soft patter against the window. Her wrist scarred but healed. The town was quiet, the mob's fury spent. The deaths blamed on the storm, on madness, on the clockman who'd vanished. She stared at the table, her hands trembling, and saw it a bone clock, small and pale, its hands at 6, its tick a whisper in the silence. "Sam," she said, her voice breaking, and the tick answered, soft and sweet, "Feed me Mara." A letter lay beside it, yellowed and brittle, her name scratched in jagged script. "Mara Finch will drown, and the clock will turn." She smiled, tears streaking her face, and reached for the knife, the tick growing louder, the keeper's laugh echoing through the walls, through her, through Dunhaven forever.